Did you know that the majority of people think that they are better drivers than average? Most think that they have higher IQs than others, and many people think that they are actually really effective listeners. However, only 2% of the population has actually been taught to listen. I wanted to reintroduce you to deep listening expert.
I'm Oscar Trimboli, and I'm completely obsessed about the commercial implication of not listening. I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world by 2030.
Before we start 2019, I thought we might want to consider focusing on becoming better listeners as leaders. Again, this is a throwback to one of 2019's best podcast interviews by TLCG. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome to the Leadership Coaching Group's podcast. I'm your host, Liz Howard, an entrepreneur, author, and executive leadership coach. This is where I introduce you to the top experts that discuss the burning topics that leaders at all levels need to know about. My goal is to help you become a leader that you are confident others will want to follow. So, subscribe to the show, listen in weekly, and watch your confidence as a leader grow. And now, please welcome Oscar Trimboli to the podcast. Oscar is a deep listening expert and former marketing director at Microsoft. Oscar decided to dedicate himself to understanding the science and art of listening to create positive impacts both in the workplace and the world. While working at Microsoft, he rebuilt the graduate leadership program, which was then implemented in 26 countries. Oscar is passionate about creating effective communication and fostering leadership for the next generation, hoping to build a tribe of deep listeners. So, Oscar, it seems to me that the fastest way to create problems in any relationship that a person might have, be it with clients, with the people that work for you, or even in personal relationships, is to make another person feel unheard. Can you tell us what the cost is of not listening?
The cost of not listening is conflict, chaos, and confusion in the workplace. And the reality is we've all heard multiple surveys, whether that's from large or small organizations, about employees leave their managers. And we hear that statistic quoted quite regularly. But the number one reason why people leave their managers is because they don't feel heard. They either repeat what they've been saying about problems in getting their work done, and it's not acted on by the manager or the organization, or managers don't even take the time to listen to what the employee is saying. They don't keep the one-on-ones. They don't reply to any kind of messages, whether that's instant messenger, email, Slack messages, or even telephone calls. So the cost is not just the cost of turnover. The cost is the cost to bring somebody on board. The cost is the impact on customers. The cost is the impact on suppliers. And there is a reason why high-performing organizations do a great job of keeping talent, because that means that there's organizational memory, and that increases the performance of an organization by a factor of 3 compared to those who have average turnover in their organization with the wrong kind of employees leaving the organization.
Yeah, that's a big deal. And
it's
so
a lot of money.
A lot of money. Yeah. And like you said, I think also it just sort of the organizational memory, how things have worked, what we've done, who we've worked with even in the past. Those are very pricey things to lose, aren't they?
Yeah, and it also means that things get done much faster when we talk about. We spent the 20th century learning how to speak. There's an industry of public speaking programs, communication programs, yet the hack of the 21st century is learning how to listen. We spend at least 55% of our day listening. If you're a manager, you're spending up to 70% of your day listening. And if you're an exec, over 80% of your day listening. Yet only 2% of us know how. And in the work that I've done and others in helping people to improve their listening, they get back half a day a week. So it's not just the lost cost when somebody leaves the organization. Listening done well means you get more time back. Why does that happen? Because you don't have to repeat yourself in the next meeting or explain what the project scope is. In a lot of cases, people turn up every month over and over again to a meeting around a project work in progress or a campaign work in progress, and they realize they haven't heard what the other person said. And when they ask them how you're progressing on that, you say you're complete. The reality is they don't think you're anywhere near that. So if we could listen just a little bit better, we could get so much time back, not only in our own day, but in the day of others. That's other people we work with, it's our customers and suppliers, and that's more important than just money alone. Everybody's struggling with time. If we could get time back, that would make an impact beyond words.
It sure would. As I'm listening to this, I am nodding my head and I'm in total agreement with you, but I can't help but wonder, how can you actually tell if you have a problem? Maybe how would you know that you're not a particularly good listener if you happen to fall into that camp?
Yeah, here's 3 funny statistics. Number one, 86% of people think they're above average drivers. 82% of people think that they have above average IQ. And 84% of people think they're above average listeners. So most people think that they are great listeners and don't really understand that they're struggling with listening. So if you're continuously having to repeat yourself to somebody else, or somebody else asks to explain that a different way, you may not be a great listener. The other thing to keep in mind is a great listener is somebody who listens in colour rather than black and white. Most of us have been taught to listen to words and look at the body language, and this is rather basic listening. The way you understand if you're a great listener is you listen through 5 dimensions, and most literature will teach you to focus on the speaker. That's handy, but if that's where you start, you're starting off with false foundations. The most important person for you to listen to is yourself. Now, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but if you go into a conversation with a lot of distraction in your head, you've got the last conversation in your head, you've got the next conversation in your head, you've got your shopping list in your head, you've got the pickup schedule for the kids in your head, you've got to figure out how to get to a sports game, or you've got to get to the gym. With all this dialogue going in your head, there's no room for the conversation to take place. So the fastest way, Liz, for somebody to notice whether they're a good listener or not is notice, is there a story going on as I'm listening to this person that's not about them? If I can turn up to the conversation with a space in my mind for their conversation to land, then I know I'm on track to be a good listener. But we've surveyed nearly 1,410 people, and the top 4 things people struggle with when it comes to listening: focus, distraction, and these 2 areas of really basic, making sure that you're right in the moment, are the difference between good and great listeners. Now, most of us probably have a cell phone or an iPad or a laptop in front of us during a conversation, and it means we're completely distracted, so we're not available. So the question you want to ask yourself is, to be a good listener, am I available to hear the other person rather than am I listening to the other person? So that's the first thing, Liz, and it's the most foundational.
That I like what you said a lot, and I certainly can relate to the distracted era that we live in. You said something I kind of want to dig into a little bit. You said that great listeners listen in color instead of black and white. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, black and white is basically, in the 80s and 90s, we had this movement called the active listening movement, and some people may have read literature on this or may have even attended a course. And the reality is this listening movement was really great in starting the world off in understanding what's the basics of listening. But there's 5 levels of listening to move from black and white, and black and white is just hearing and seeing. That's the way most people are taught how to listen. So let's think about 5 different dimensions of listening. Level 1, listening to yourself. Level 2, listening to the content. Level 3, listening to the context. Level 4, listening to what's not said. And then level 5, listening for what they actually mean rather than just what they say. Now, if you start to listen there, you've got a bigger spectrum than black and white. You've got some colors starting to emerge, and you're working on a palette of listening that helps you overcome a really basic distraction in neuroscience. See, the reason we are distracted, Liz, is the 125-400 rule, which says I'm speaking at about 125 words a minute. Liz, you can listen to 400 words a minute. So you're filling in the gaps. If you're only listening to my words, you're filling in the gaps with the other 300 words. And usually the way you're filling in the gaps is some other story you're making up about yourself. So for those of us who are listening right now, you may be driving to work, you may be driving home, you may be in the gym, you may be doing some chores around the house, but the reality is you're not completely present for this conversation. So black and white listening is really just level 2 listening to the content being what you see, what you hear, and what you feel. There are so many more dimensions to listening than just those.
That makes sense. And I think that this is a very complex, potentially, conversation that we're having, and I want to just kind of bring it back to why it's relevant to our listeners. So again, many of the people that are dialed into the show right now are either in a leadership role or they're trying to be in one. So we were kind of talking about some of the financial implications of why managers of the workplace should care about making their people feel heard. Are there any other things that leaders really need to be aware of as to why it's important for leaders, for people in charge of other people, to be really great listeners?
I'm sure everybody's heard about Lego, and everyone's heard about the Lego movies, but the very first Lego movie was a complete financial disaster because they didn't listen to their fans. The first Lego movie made about $69,000 at the box office. $69,000 didn't really cover their production costs. And what the CEO of Lego understood at that time was they needed a different approach. He still believed that movies could reinvigorate what Lego was all about. And he hired Lord and Miller, which were US producers and directors. And they weren't amazing directors. They weren't Oscar award-winning directors. Their claim to fame was the movie 21 Jump Street. And if you're from my era, that used to be a TV show. And what Lord and Miller did for 6 months is they visited the meetup groups on Saturdays called Adult Fans of Lego. And these people basically run meetings for 3 hours on a Saturday and create tasks for each other and challenges. But as Lord and Miller started listening to these people and what they cared about in Lego, they discovered a really simple thing. And the simple thing is honest Lego makers, honest Lego constructors, honest Lego fans don't use glue. But there's this subculture within the community called the Kegel, which are a group within the Lego community that do use glue to keep the Lego pieces together. Now, what they did was because they were listening so deeply to the community, they incorporated this little nuance into the plot of the movie. And as a result, the Lego fans, the adult fans of Lego, felt heard and became ambassadors for the movie. The next movie did about $250 million US at the box office.
Wow.
The next series of 7 Lego movies did well over $1 billion. There's a whole computer game franchise with Nintendo and Xbox, and that's another $1 billion in revenue. And the impact that it created a new group of fans, a new generation of kids who are engaged with Lego in a completely different way. At that time, whether Lego was to continue or not, it was struggling with profitability, and they had to sell off one of their theme parks to keep the company going. Because Lego decided it was okay to listen to their fans, they added nearly $3 billion to their ongoing revenue. So sometimes we think about the cost of not listening as the literal cost, but there's also the missed opportunity. And with this simple Lego example of listening to your fans a little bit more deeply, It's okay to turn up to the meets and listen and watch what they're doing, but to take the time and listen to the story about the glue and the Kegel, that was the difference between Lego continuing on a fairly average path to adding $3 billion of annual revenues across 3 diversified ways that they hadn't thought about in the future.
This sounds very familiar because I've worked with people in the past, and after they've left a company, they kind of like to predict the problems that the organization's going to incur, or at least their department. And they said, I see this coming from a mile away. I'm in it day in and day out, and no one's listening to me. And this product's going to fail, or, this team's going to struggle, or this client's going to be lost, and no one will hear me. And, they just they leave because they see disaster coming. And it's all too often that they're absolutely right. And the company had the answer right in front of them, but they couldn't get the message through for some reason.
Yeah, and leaders are taught to do this very corporate thing called the listening tour, which when you get appointed as a new leader, one of the things that you tick off your to-do list is you go and listen to your team and your stakeholders, and if you're really brave, you might go and talk to some customers and suppliers and some influencers in the marketplace. The reality is most listening tours fail because they don't actually listen. All they do is hear, but they don't act. The difference between hearing and listening is action. And if you're planning to do a listening tour as a leader, the number one thing to remember is this very simple thing. For the same amount of time you spend listening to the people that you think are influencing your organization, you need to invest the identical amount of time in the action plan that results from it. So if you're going to spend a week going around the country or around the world listening to people, you make sure that you spend a week putting together an action plan and communicating that to the stakeholders over the time between then and your next listening tour. Now, listening tours are a bit dated. Listening should be something that you do consistently. It's a practice. It's not something that's one-off. Politicians do this as well, Liz. They do a listening tour and then they get the memory of a goldfish and forget everything that happens as they go out and make different kinds of promises. So the listening tour as a device, it's interesting, but you've got to invest the same amount of time into an action plan from the listening tour as just hearing from people.
I notice sometimes people can be a little bit nervous to talk to a new leader, or even an established leader for that matter. It can be a bit intimidating. Is there anything that we can do to kind of encourage people to open up? So if we're ready to be deep listeners, and if we're ready to really absorb and take action, that we can foster an environment where there's something to listen to?
The critical thing is always to keep it in the lens of an external stakeholder, be it a customer, a supplier, or a regulator. It could be an influencer in your marketplace. But the big question that you can ask a leader all the time is, what does this mean for our customers? What does this mean for our future customers? What does this mean for the customers we're looking to gain from our competitors? So if you're a bit nervous talking to a new leader, ask them those questions. The change you're bringing about, what does this mean for our customers? Because a lot of leaders inside systems get very internally orientated and they forget why they're there. The organizations that grow the fastest, that anticipate what the customers need the most, are the ones that are going to grow. So if you're nervous, just make sure you talk to the leader and ask them questions about the customers and the marketplace, and that'll make it really simple for both of you.
That's good. And you talk about 4 villains in listening. What are those?
Well, because we've never been taught how to listen, most of us channel one of these 4 villains of listening that comes through the research we've done. The first listener and the most obvious listener that's a villain, that's the dark side of listening, that's the ones we get frustrated with the most when people do this to us, is the interrupting listener. Now, I'm quite fond of the interrupting listener because at least they're present in the conversation, and the interrupting listener thinks the moment you draw breath It's their commercial break to come in and tell you what they're thinking. The interrupting listener is overt. You know they're doing it, which is kind of contrast to the next villain, which is the lost listener. The lost listener doesn't really quite know why they're there. They're vague. They might understand why they're meant to be here. They may not. And one question you can always ask a lost listener is, what are you hoping to achieve from this conversation? Particularly in larger organizations that are run by many, many meetings, people are invited out of courtesy rather than necessity, and the lost listener will be very evident. They'll be very vague. They'll rarely engage in the conversation. And some of us can relate to this because listening is situational and relational. You might find a lost listener who's a relative of yours. It might be an uncle, it might be an auntie, might be a cousin at a family function. They're not quite sure why they're in the conversation. The next listener is the dramatic listener. They love listening to you because they can tell you about a bigger drama in their life than you've got, no matter what you say. If you've got the worst boss, they've had a worse boss than you. If you've got a bad supplier, they've had a worse supplier than you. If you're struggling and you're struggling to meet your budget, they've been in worse situations than you. The dramatic listener loves a conversation because it just gives them a platform to tell you their most fabulous stories. And unlike the interrupting listener, they'll take the time to listen to you, but then they'll take the conversation wherever they want to or wherever they choose to find a little bit more drama in the conversation. And then finally, the shrewd listener. The shrewd listener is somebody you feel like is actually listening to you. Now, the shrewd listener is disproportionately represented in sales professions, consulting professions, helping professions. Even people like you, Liz, might suffer from the curse of the shrewd listener, because the shrewd listener is holding their hand on their chin and listening intently, but while you're talking, all they're thinking about is how they're going to fix you and your problem, and explaining to yourself in the shrewd listener's head, once they've got that problem figured out, I'm going to tell them about 3 more problems they haven't even figured out because I'm so smart. And the shrewd listener, to me, is one of the biggest villains of listening, because they come across like they're listening, but they're not completely present, listening deeply to what that person's saying, and more importantly, meaning, because they're trying to solve the problem of that person. And that's not the job of listening. The job of listening is to fully hear what they say and fully hear what they don't say. So for a lot of the times, a shrewd listener is not really listening to what's unsaid and creates a very elegant solution to a problem that that person doesn't actually have. So they're the 4 villains of listening.
And this is the first time on a show anyone's called me a villain, Oscar, so thank you. No, but I do agree.
Struggle with solutions?
That's an interesting question. I guess I'll have to go back and listen to some of my podcasts. But I think, sure. I could definitely see how that could come about. And, the sad thing about it, and I agree that it is a villain and maybe one in a disguise, because when I have done that, I think it's out of hope for helpfulness instead of being as present, which is what I think you were getting at. So absolutely. I'm interested, though, if we can go back to sort of the dramatic and maybe even the shrewd listener, perhaps. When some people hear that you're experiencing something or you're going through a certain situation, I think they have a desire to commiserate or to make you feel like, hey, you're not alone. I've been there with you. Here's an example of that. Is there ever space in deep listening or in great listening to say, hey, I've been there too? Or should we just take that away?
Depends what you're trying to achieve from the conversation. I think for a lot of people in an organizational context, a really simple question will help answer yours, Liz. I'm curious what else you're thinking about on this topic. although you can speak at 125 words a minute, I can listen at 400 words a minute. The speaker can think at 900 words per minute.
Yeah.
So the likelihood that the very first thing out of their mouth is a really well-articulated explanation of what's in their mind is about a 1 in 9 chance, or about 11% chance, that what they're saying is actually what they're thinking. Now, I don't know about you, Liz, but if you had an 11% chance of surviving a surgery, you'd probably ask for a second opinion.
Yes.
So the important thing for us to do as deep listeners is help them to explore fully the spectrum of their thinking.
Mm.
So in a workplace, a lot of the time it could be as simple as, hey, before we try and get into a solution on this, how much have you thought about this? Or what else have you thought about this? Is there anything else, now that we've talked about it, that you've considered as useful? So I'm not saying that empathizing with a person is good or bad. That's absolutely a human connection that we need to create. But I think there's a tension that, particularly in the West, as opposed to Eastern high context cultures who are very comfortable with silence, in the West, we kind of fill that space up really quickly. And we don't give silence enough time and enough power. We don't give silence the same reverence as another word. We should listen to silence fully and completely, and we should be comfortable with it. So I think for the shrewd listeners and the dramatic listener examples that you raised there, Liz, I'd just be comfortable asking, I'm curious what else you're thinking about on this topic, because most of the time they'll use these 3 code words.
Hey guys, hope you're enjoying the show so far. You know, TLCG does more than just podcasts. We work with organizations to help minimize internal conflict, maximize productivity, and help support current and aspiring leaders grow into the most effective stewards possible. Reach out to us to help with individual issues, team issues, or to be speakers at your next event. The best way to get in touch with us is just to visit our website at theleadershipcoachinggroup.com and send us a message through our contact page. All right, let's get back to the interview.
Because most of the time they'll use these 3 code words. What's really important to me is it's not until we get to there that we're ready to find a solution, that we're ready to empathize, because the reality is everyone's brain is like a washing machine. Most of the time it's dirty on wash cycle, there's suds running around, and the water's quite murky. It's not till we get to rinse cycle, which is when we speak, that our mind connects with the idea in a powerful way. So the more rinse cycles, the better. And that's exploring the unsaid.
And I guess helping someone get to the rinse cycle is a form of leadership in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, and it takes a skillful, confident leader to be completely comfortable with not knowing. The difference that I've found between good managers and great leaders inspire confidence even when they don't know, because they realize that the team has enough collective wisdom to solve this together. So it is not a surprise that great listeners, great leaders ask great questions. And most of the time, they're not asking questions that are in the frame of why. Why questions are loaded with judgment, or why questions remind us of growing up when we did something wrong, and our mum or dad might ask us, why did we do that? Great leaders ask questions about what and how. So leaders who ask questions about how do we make this real, or what do we need to do to move this forward without being prescriptive, harness an amazing energy in the group, because the group thinks they've created the solution themselves rather than it being an edict from the leader. So great leaders ask great questions, and the great questions they ask are more around what and how rather than why.
It's an interesting point because it almost seems that can serve to create a type of psychological safety. If you are asking questions that are very connected to a what and a how with your employees, it could make them feel valued, and it could make them feel, like their voice matters. And it seems to me that it does take an amount of psychological safety for people to really open up to a leader. And that might be a good way to set that stage.
Yeah, I think in a lot of Western organizations, people approach the workplace like they do the family. They treat their manager as a parent. They treat the manager's manager as a grandparent. And what we want to do is create an environment that we're all fully expressed adults. We all have relevant views. It just happens at the moment somebody's got a baton that has them in a leadership position for the time being. Just like ducks who fly in formation, ducks use 63% less energy if they fly in formation together, but the same duck isn't always in the leadership position. The duck, they actually change positions. So they can fly 63% faster as a group than they can do individually. And exactly the same thing, that energy is liberated when leaders not only ask questions themselves and allow the team to answer them, but also create an environment where people can ask the leaders questions and the rest of the group questions as well, where you see teams move from average performance to high performance through a listening orientation is all perspectives are explored in the group, and not only the extrovert's perspective or the people who are most expert in the topic. High-performing teams who listen well will invite all perspectives and, independent of hierarchy, will ask questions of each other as comfortably as they would appear to a manager or to the manager's manager or to a manager's peer. So you're right, Liz, it definitely creates a sense of trust, which opens up the environment to ensure that through questions we can have creative conflict rather than avoiding conflict, which tends to suppress, which tends to create mistrust, which tends to create low performance.
So what's the first step that someone can take if they're like, I know that this is important. I hear Oscar. It makes sense. I want to do 1% better today. What is the step to take so that they can just be a little bit better today than they were yesterday?
Yeah. Pick any one of these three simple tips. They are: the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. A hydrated brain is a listening brain. Drink a glass of water in every meeting you're in and remove distractions. You're not really that important. Take away the laptop, take away the cell phone, take away the tablet and put them to one side. The deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen is a simple fact of neuroscience. You get more oxygen to the brain. Listening is a hard task because we've never been taught how to do it. Imagine trying to pick up a golf club or a tennis racket for the first time and no one's showing you how. For most of us, that's what listening is. So the more oxygen we can get to the brain, the better its performance. There was a study done in 1993 out of Ottawa in Canada, and it basically said that the most productive conversations, the person listening breathed deeply, but eventually they synchronized their breathing with the person who was speaking as well. So just simply holding your breath for 5 seconds longer or becoming conscious of your breath before you go into a conversation, that's a simple thing for you to do. The second thing is take a glass of water into every conversation. The brain consumes 25% of the blood sugars of the system that is the body, but it's only 5% of the body mass. So it's a really hungry organ. So a hydrated brain will get blood sugars there quicker. You'll be able to perform better and concentrate for longer, stay focused and be less distracted. And then the easiest thing is remove those physical distractions. I worked with a leader who ran an organization of 50,000 people, and he traveled from Seattle to Sydney, and we were hosting 10 CEOs in a room in Melbourne. And he was just about to sit down at the head of the room and got up, apologized, took his cell phone out of his jacket pocket, switched it off and put it in his bag about 2 feet away. He said, "The most important thing I can offer you right now is my attention, and I'm here to listen." Now, Liz, what do you think happened with the rest of the room, with the other 10 people? What do you think they did next?
Well, hopefully they put their phones away.
Yeah, so 7 out of 10 people put their phones away. And as he left at about 45-minute mark to go on his next set of meetings, I debriefed the room, and the room completely to a person commented exactly on that fact. And for you listening out there, if you're a manager, you need to role model great listening. A lot of people say, my staff don't listen to me. There is a reason, because you're not a great role model of listening. Start today, switch the cell phone off at least for 1 meeting a day, and you'll be amazed the impact you'll make, and it'll be an impact beyond words. So those 3 things, really simple. The deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. Take a glass of water to every meeting, switch off any electronic device and remove them from sight. You'll be amazed what that does.
It's so cool. I mean, sometimes we forget about just the basics. What you and I were talking offline before the recording, listening to people is just kind of a human element of connection that's very important. But even thinking about our own self-care, we have to breathe, we have to be hydrated. It's so interconnected. And I think that it's kind of a beautiful thing, but probably a little easy to lose balance with. So that's just a good reminder. Take a deep breath, be hydrated, and put the device away. And it's simple, but wow, what a big impact.
Yeah, and if you drink coffee every morning, you're going to have to drink a glass of water for every cup of coffee you have, because that's going to dehydrate you as well. Just remember, there's a reason Olympic athletes, opera singers, and Navy SEALs practice their breathing as one of the major parts of their performance, because it's critical to getting oxygen into the system, and you can perform at a completely different level.
Wow. So, Oscar, as we wrap up our interview, there's one question I like to ask all my guests. And if you had just one piece of advice to offer someone who is newly minted in a leadership role, what would it be?
You're enough. Just be yourself, completely and fully expressed, and stop judging yourself. You're enough.
Really good stuff. So if people want to learn more about you and the good work that you do, where can they go?
If you're listening on a podcast right now and you want to learn more about deep listening, just type in deep listening into your podcast application, and I run a podcast where I interview professional listeners, air traffic controllers, suicide counselors, judges, journalists, foreign language interpreters, and you can learn the hacks that they use when they have to listen and concentrate for a long period of time. Type my name into LinkedIn. I'll be happy to connect with you, Oscar Trimboli. And there's only one Oscar Trimboli, so if you type Oscar Trimboli into Google, you'll find my website, and you can look up the book, the playing cards, and find out so much more about how to make an impact beyond words simply by listening.
I really appreciate the time and this important message that you're sharing with all of us, Oscar. Thank you so much.
Hey guys, if you're getting anything out of this show, please head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. I read every single one, and honestly, your feedback is single-handedly what keeps this show going. So go to iTunes and let us know you're listening. Thank you so much for being a part of our community.